We will attempt, we've allocated about 2 minutes after each presentation for questions, so we'll try and get to yours, but I do apologise in advance if we run out of time. And depending on how we go with the schedule, we'll also try and have some more general Q&A and discussion after the last speaker. So here at UQ, we're fortunate to have a team dedicated to enhancing cybersecurity initiatives, and our newly launched cybersecurity strategy reflects the constantly evolving threat landscape and the diverse needs of the university and our society more broadly. A couple of our recent milestones include the launch of the first Australian Master of Cybersecurity program that explicitly aligns with the internationally recognised National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, which is the current gold standard for cybersecurity education and workforce skills alignment. In November of 2020, we established an Industry 4.0 energy test lab in partnership with Siemens and with funding support from the Australian Federal Government. The test lab facilitates research and education in critical infrastructure resilience and cybersecurity. Now, I believe that we have Major General Professor Isaac bin Israel online. Is that correct, Major General?
Yes, I hope you hear me.
Fantastic, thank you. So before we get to our speakers today, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the Major General to deliver the welcome address. Professor bin Israel graduated from Tel Aviv University with degrees in mathematics, physics and philosophy, earning his PhD in 1988. A retired Major General of the Israeli Air Force, Professor bin Israel has served as Director of Defence R&D Directorate in the Ministry of Defence. He is a multiple recipient of the Israel Defense Award and was a member of the Knesset from 2007 to 2009. He is currently chair of the Israeli Space Agency, head of the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, and the Yuval Ne'eman Workshop for Science, Technology and Security at Tel Aviv University. In 2010, he was appointed by Israel's Prime Minister to lead the task force which developed the plan to establish Israel as a major international player in cybersecurity. And in 2018, he was appointed once more by the Prime Minister to lead the next revolution in Israel, secure artificial intelligence. Welcome and thank you, Major General Professor Isaac bin Israel.
Thank you. I thought that for introduction, I will give you a very short briefing, 3-4 minutes, about the center, the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Research Center here at Tel Aviv University. But for this, I need to share my screen. Just a minute. Okay. I hope you see it. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So the center was established some 6 years ago, 7 years ago. One of the recommendations of the program, the plan that I submitted to the government that was mentioned before in 2011 was to have research centers in every research university, cyber research centers in every research university in Israel. And we were the first one to, in 2014, to be created. And since then, we developed, we have more than 150 principal investigators. Most of them, or more than half of them, come from Tel Aviv University, but there are some researchers coming from other universities and research centers and industry as well. If I count only Tel Aviv members, and if I'm adding the graduate students, it's over 220 people, more than 150 papers established in peer-reviewed journals. This is all done in Tel Aviv University. It's the biggest one in Israel, more than 30,000 students, multidisciplinary university, all the faculties. Last week, we heard that it came out number 5 in the world in some index. In terms of innovation, I mean, they measured how many graduates of Tel Aviv University were involved in in technology, unicorns, etc. And this is the university. And the center by itself, the most important word in the name is interdisciplinary. And that's because we believe that although most of the current problems in the 21st century we solve by technology, still the problems are almost never purely technological. In order to understand the problem, you need to take into account legal problems, psychology of individuals, business considerations, etc. And therefore, the center is interdisciplinary, and almost practically all the faculties here in Tel Aviv University are members of this center, including, of course, the hardcore, technological hardcore. This is the computer science, mathematics, and engineering. 2/3 of our researchers come from these faculties, but 1/3 comes from business school, school of law, etc., even social sciences, philosophy. We also put a lot of emphasis on creating local as well as international partnerships. You can see some of them here. We established already 6-7 years ago a joint cyber lab with Italy, with Singapore, and this is international, and the same with local industry. I'll give you, because of this international activity, we were selected by the World Bank to launch in this year a plan to help developing countries in terms of securing the new build critical infrastructure. And here you can see some of the activities that we do in this context. I can give you a few examples on some papers out of the 150 that attracted, I would say, not only the professional journals, but also legal authorities everywhere in the world, or the media even. And you can see here 3 examples. And last thing that I would like to mention is that we have every year a Cyber Week conference. Today you can find it almost everywhere in the world, but we were the first to launch it in 2011, the first one. So we celebrate more than 10 years now to this Cyber Week. Usually, if I take the Corona out of the game, in a normal year, usually we had something like close to 10,000 people coming from more than 80 countries in the world. And it is a conference. It's not an exhibition, for selling products, something like that. You come to it, you see people sitting in rooms in the Tel Aviv campus, talking about issues. And as I said, interdisciplinary. Decision-making, legal problems, as well as, of course, technology and science and computer science, etc. And during the Corona, we replaced it a year ago by virtual conference, and last year we did a hybrid. Still some 3,000 people came physically. And there are activities like this. The last comment that I would say that we started already 2 years ago to do the same with artificial intelligence. And the next event will happen in February. Of course, you are all invited to participate. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Major General, for that introduction to your centre and overview of your activities. So now let's move to the first of our research presentations for today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Amir Globison. He's professor at the Tel Aviv University Computer Science Department. He holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from the Hebrew University and was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and at the University of Toronto. And today he's going to be talking to us about optimal strategies for AI-based attacks. Over to you, Professor Globison.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone who was involved in organizing this workshop. I'll talk about optimal strategies for AI-based attacks. And my starting point is that today, in recent years, we've seen huge progress in this endeavor of having computers generate seemingly realistic outputs. So one example is these faces. I think most of you have seen this. So these faces actually do not exist. There are no such people. These faces are automatically generated by a computer model. And we have various dialogue systems where machines interact with humans. So it's now possible to generate things that are not real, not produced by any real human, but actually look very realistic. Now, that's very useful for many things, but it also brings about many challenges in terms of security, where we could have someone impersonate someone else or use this type of technology to infiltrate the systems that we want to be secure. So here's another example of using such technology to impersonate President Bush. Right, and there are many more such examples. So this brings about this impersonation problem where one could use these generative models to impersonate users of system and use these systems in ways that could be harmful. And this is, we think this is a real problem, and it's a real challenge from a research perspective to think of methods to overcome this issue. And of course, it's not just photos or images or video, it's also voice, retinal scans, fingerprints, what have you. So there is technology, AI-based technology that could conceivably be used to generate such false images with in intent to break security systems. Right, so here in the work I'll very briefly describe, we address this problem in the context of source authentication. So imagine you have your phone that is trained to recognize your face. And what if someone wanted to break that security system using AI-based tools? So what would be the idea? If someone could generate an image that looks exactly like you, then it could hack into your phone, right? And that we don't want that. So our first observation is that someone could actually do this if he has enough images of you. He could use these images to present them to the phone and learn a model of what you look like, and then be authenticated. So a natural idea to overcome this is just to ask for more images of you. So maybe someone can steal 1 or 2 images of you, but then if you ask for 10 images, that's harder for someone trying to break in. So we thought about this problem in terms of how much data do we need to present to the authentication system, and how does that compare to the data that someone can steal from you? So in this work, we basically formalized this problem, and we looked at the various data sources and the data sizes that are involved, and we developed a deep learning system for both defending and attacking in this context. So here's an overview of the setup. So we assume there's a source that wants to be authenticated. There's an impersonator that can steal some images from the source. And then at authentication time, we ask whoever's trying to enter the system to present n images, okay? So intuitively, we'd want n to be larger than m so that authentication can succeed. And so we basically set up this problem as a 2-game setup. And we showed various results that give good intuition for what's happening. For example, if the impersonator has more examples than required, then authentication will fail. We show this formally. And we also analyzed the more interesting case where you ask for more images than the authenticator can provide, and we analyze the error in this setting. And then based on these intuitions, we developed this deep learning framework we call GAN in the middle, sort of a pun on man in the middle attacks, that's used to both find optimal attack and defense in this setting. So let me just show you some results. So this is what happens when you increase the number of images that the authenticator needs to show. And this is our model here in blue. And we see that we have a better accuracy against several attacks that we used here than other baselines. So this does result in more effective defense against AI-based attacks. Here are just some examples of what the system generates. So for example, in this character recognition problem, this was the real character, and these are sort of fake characters that our attacker tries to use to emulate this true character. And so you can see things look similar to the original, but somewhat different, which is challenging because then there's noise that you need to recognize. Right, so that's our sort of GAN or AI-based attack approach. Another thing we're working on quite extensively is this problem again of generating content with some prescribed, generating fake, say, images with given prescribed content, right? So imagine you want to generate someone who's saying something or a visual scene that contains certain attributes. How do you do that? That's certainly a central goal for AI, both for other reasons and also in terms of security. So for example, let's say you want to generate a video scene with objects moving in a certain way, and we have a model for doing that. This is for synthetic, but we also have this for real videos. Or you want to generate an image with a prescribed content. So in the bottom is the original image, and in the top is images that we create, our model creates, with roughly the same semantic content. Okay, so just to conclude, the generative AI models pose, they do a lot of good things, but they also pose potential security threats. And a key aspect is what the data that is accessible to the attacker, what type of data, what's the amount, et cetera. And it's important to understand this from a theoretical and practical perspective. And as we showed, it's possible to model this, and these insights result in useful algorithms. Yep, so that's what I have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Globison. So I'd invite the audience to put any questions they have for Professor Globison in the chat, and I'll relay them here. In the meantime, I guess just a kickoff question from you, from me. In the motivating example you presented at the start with, say, a phone authentication and presenting multiple images, how would you see that being realized? Is that the camera asking the user to present different faces or different angles? I'm curious to sort of get a physical interpretation of that.
Yeah, I think different angles is the most natural, I think, where it would be hard for someone who just has like one image of you, it will be hard to capture all these variations. So introduce various sort of axes of change to challenge someone who's trying to attack the system.
All right, thanks. I love the idea of those. You're sort of creating a meta GAN by putting the sort of, you're playing two games between attacker and defender around a system that's probably using a GAN to generate those attacks. It's a really neat concept. Any questions from the audience or from any of the other presenters? No? Okay, well, look, thanks very much, Professor Globison, for your presentation. Greatly appreciated. So we move on now to Professor Emeritus Yehuda Afek, who is a professor at the Tel Aviv University Computer Science Department. His research interests range from distributed systems through to tightly coupled multiprocessor architectures. And today he's going to be talking to us about NXNS attack, a new attack on the DNS system and proposed mitigation. Over to you, Professor Afek.
Okay, you see the screen and you hear me okay? Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, we've got you, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm going to talk about the vulnerability of the DNS system, with work done with two of my partners, Professor Anat Wemler-Bar and Lior Shafir. We'll quickly review the DNS system, go over the attack and some mitigation options. We found out that all the major vendors, producers of DNS software, are vulnerable to this attack, including many of the open resolvers like Google, Cloudflare, and most other ones. So the DNS system, as you all know, once it's shut down, if under attack, in the area where it had been attacked, nobody can reach its shopping, no Zoom, cannot reach its email. It's really a devastating attack. It's an Achilles heel for the entire internet system. And if you have a major attack, you can disconnect billions of users from all their social and activities on the internet. That's the page you will get when the DNS doesn't work. If you try to open Zoom, you won't get it to the Zoom, you'll get such a page, and for everything else. DNS system is a huge database consisting of more than 10 million servers around the globe, divided mostly into two types. There is name servers, authoritatives, and resolvers, and the client sitting all over the world. How does it work? Basically, a client wants to reach the CS department at UCLA. He asks a resolver, and the resolver doesn't have the reply in the cache. So he asks at top level, the root of the DNS system, what's the IP address for this domain, the ucla.edu? I don't know, you should ask the .edu. So the resolver goes to .edu. What's the IP address for cs.ucla.edu? He says, you should ask the name server at ucla.edu. And hopefully the address of this server is in the cache. He goes and asks, get the reply and get the result, and can go and visit the webpage of UCLA. Same thing for Queensland or any other place in the world. What are the key requirements from this system? Mostly it's high availability. If it's not available, you cannot reach any of your resources on the internet. And the response has to be very quick, because the latency of translating your IP address, your domain name into an IP address, is added to the time it takes you to reach Zoom or Amazon shopping carts or your email. So it's very important to have it working, highly available and fast response. Therefore, one thing that the DNS system is done, if a server like the name server at UCLA doesn't respond, is failed, it requires every name server, authoritative name server, to have duplicates and mirror copies, and to have a referral response. It's a key for the attack. So actually this work, we started to look just on the efficiency of resolvers. There's machines here on the left. And we found out that when they translate a name, they make a lot of extra requests. So here, the .edu tells the resolver, look, you can ask any one of the following 4 name servers to get the resource IP address for UCLA. Because UCLA keeps a mirror both at USC, at ISI, and other locations nearby in Los Angeles. And then when this doesn't respond, he goes and asks the other one and gets, or the third one, and gets the reply. Same thing happens, by the way, at higher levels of the hierarchy. The root also says if you want to reach the .edu, you can ask either this top level domain server or this or this. So a key issue here is this referral response that you have here, that the DNS must have in order to properly, reliably operate. Now, when you get this, you need to know what's the IP address of each of these domains. So the resolver now goes and translates the names that it gets. Here we get a closer look into IP addresses. And the reply from .edu doesn't contain the IP addresses because the name server is at .net, and we ask for .edu. So he cannot give you the IP addresses. So you generate more requests, and the resolver asks for more, even further requests. And actually, we figured out that in our initial experiments, when you just want to find out the IP address of Microsoft.com, we realized that our resolver actually asks 54 queries, generating more than 100 packets, just to resolve one domain name. And we thought, boy, this could be a place for an attack. And indeed, that's what we did. So this slide gives you the key, the ingredients of the attack and explains the attack in full detail. The attacker controls two things. First, he has a client that can issue requests, and he installs, and I'll explain later how easy it is. It's very easy. It installs a authoritative name server under its control, like attacker.com. It's trivial to do today on the internet. The client of the attacker make a request, something with a random string here, so it doesn't exist in the cache, to the recursive resolver. It goes and asks the attacker.com, and the attacker.com is programmed. We designed it, the attacker built it to reply with a very big, large referral response containing lots of, like 135 name server names. So it tells the resolver, you can ask any of these 135 name server names. The resolver will try to figure out what's the IP address of each of them immediately, because the DNS system was designed to work fast and reliably. So their motivation was, when I get many name servers, I would like quickly to know what's the IP addresses of each of them. So the resolver generates 135 requests, and by the new standard, it has to request both for the IP version 4 and for the IP version 6 request. So each request is twice, and we see that you get a lot of packets. You get 2 packets because of the IP version, that times 2 because of the IP version 4, IP version 6, times 2 because we send and we get a reply for each of the packets, and the packets are too large, therefore because of DNSSEC, it goes over TCP that multiplies the number of packets by 6. We divide it by 2 because the attacker itself generated 2 packets, one here from the bot and one here from its name server. So we got a total amplification factor of over 1600, which is a huge amplification factor. Now, as in the Mirai attack and many attacks on the internet, you can have hundreds of thousands or million zombies like this, all generating in the same time this attack. And you get an extremely large attack on the TLD in this case, and you simply can shut it down. So if you attack the TLD in near Australia, you can disconnect most of the people in Australia from all the resources on the internet. And both of course, the recursive resolver will die too. I mean, if there are any questions, it's a good point to ask, because this is the key building block of the attack. We have many variations. You can attack, well, we're not going to the detail, but you can attack several different resolvers and focus the attack on one TLD, knocking down this TLD. You can also have an attack goes on a SLD, second level domain, like attack only the name server of Queensland or only the authoritative name server of UCLA, knocking it down with different amplification factors. And basically this attack is really pretty devastating. It's lucky we found out it before the attackers, and we were in contact with all the name servers vendors and the open resolvers who have fixed their systems to prevent this attack. So it's mostly secure right now. This is another variation. And we can do, I won't go into the details because of time, but you can actually recursively do this attack. So you attack the attacker, you say the attacker, I attack you, but that gives the attacker now the chance to reply 74, to generate 74 referral responses, each of them with 135 fake name server names. So you can attack the root servers now, because we ask here for the fake is in the highest level domain field. and you get an amazing attack on the root servers, which could really knock down the entire DNS system for huge portions of the world. As I promised, to get an attacker to control authoritative name server is pretty easy. You can buy a domain for $1, install it, it takes a few minutes. You can associate it with any authoritative on the internet, with GoDaddy, with a level 3 or a VeriSign. You can also hijack an authoritative name server, install it there. It's very easy. We tested the attack on all these open resolvers, and they have been all vulnerable to the attack at different levels of amplification factor. Here on the right is the amplification factor. And the mitigations. We suggested several ways to mitigate. The major ones, when you get a referral response, don't try to resolve all of them. Just resolve 5 or 4 names. Don't resolve all the 135. A second one is don't allow even to issue referral responses with so many name servers. We can see here that 99% of the internet doesn't have referral names with more than 6 name servers, and most of them have less than 3. So no reason to allow such large referral responses. There are also other mitigations that I will not go into, but they're all pretty effective, and different vendors have used different mitigations. Here you see, when I tell him you can ask at most 4 name server names, and you do it 1 per request. So when I get a request, this request generated this one and doesn't ask anymore. The next request generated the next one, and the next one generated the third one. So each request from a client generates 1 extra name server resolution, and it takes the attack down and mitigates the attack. And you can see here, it gets the amplification factor down to 3. From that example was 74. There is no effect on response time. One would worry, oh, if you didn't resolve all the name server, maybe when I'm under problems, I will not get the fast responding name server. And we tested it, and there is no effect on the response time. There were several CVEs generated, so the vendors acknowledge there is a problem, fix the problem, and publicly announce a new version of the software, and that's it. This attack is very dangerous. It's 8 times more powerful than the Mirai attack that knocked down big portions of the internet on October 2016. The really worrisome is that such a thing exists in the internet. So is there other things we don't know, and that somebody could easily knock down huge portions of the internet? And are there formal methods there should be to verify that the internet is working correctly, and that the different protocols like the DNS protocol is functioning okay, it doesn't have other such vulnerabilities? We are working today on other vulnerabilities in the DNS system and trying to resolve many issues concerning the DNS system. And as we saw, the vulnerability is generated because we try to have high availability and a small response time. So the system was trying to be very efficient, to ask many requests to get all the name servers, but that enabled the vulnerability. So there is a trade-off between those two, although our mitigations didn't affect the response time or the availability as we showed. That's it. Thank you very much for organizing this workshop. And are there any questions?
Yeah, look, thanks very much, Professor Afek. We do have a couple of questions. The first one came in from Mark Utting, and he's asking, has this vulnerability always been in the DNS system? And if so, why wasn't it found years ago? Or were you able to identify a particular change that brought this into being?
So this vulnerability existed in the system since 1985, when the DNS system was designed by Paul Mokopetris from ISI in Los Angeles. And you know, the DNS system has grown, and now there are millions of resolvers and many authoritative name servers. So you get much more exposure, but the vulnerability existed from the beginning.
Wow, that's that's incredible.
That's a second point here that you might worry. Wait, is there other such problems somewhere on the DNS system or TCP or some other critical system that can devastate huge portions of the internet? It's a big issue.
Thanks very much. And look, one other follow-up from Gwandong Bai. He's curious. He's very impressed by your work and your discovery. But he's curious, how did you conduct this attack in a confined and managed environment while still keeping it real and representative of the genuine internet conditions?
It's a very good question. First of all, we had the whole setup. We have our own lab, but we produced the lab in Amazon machines in the cloud. We installed our own resolver and our own authoritative and tested between them. Then we tried on the open resolvers. We just sent them one attack packet, and we saw how many responses because we controlled an authoritative. We generated our own authoritative, and we attacked it with Google and Cloudflare, and we saw how many packets we got from them, monitor the traffic that we got back from them on our servers in the cloud. But it's a very good question. And then we collaborated. Actually, we gave the vendors 90 days to the disclosure. We told them you have 90 days to fix it before we publish it, and then the attackers can also go on and do the attack. And some of them didn't believe. They said, no, we had to convince them. For 2 weeks, we argued with them. No, it's a real problem. No, it cannot be. But after 2 weeks, they said, okay, you're right. It's a huge problem. And they went on and fixed it.
Wow, fantastic. So look, I've got other questions, but we do have to move on in the interest of time, but we'll be able to connect researchers afterwards to have the more detailed discussions. Thanks very much, Professor Emeritus Afek. Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Abigail Clay. She's a research fellow in cybersecurity here at the University of Queensland, and her research interests are in threat detection and applied machine learning. And today she's talking to us on the topic of towards scalable cybersecurity dataset generation. Over to you, Abigail.
Thanks, John. Good day to everyone, especially to our friends in Tel Aviv University. So this is a work I've worked together with my colleagues at UQ, Professor Ranko, Dr. Gwandong, Mr. Taejun Choi, and also our collaborators from ANET, Dr. Miao-Xie and Mr. Charles Stenner. So before I go into the work that we are doing, so just want to highlight that cyber attack is a global threat. So this is a report by Akamai for this year about the state of the internet. So we can see here the daily web application attack since January 2000 till June 30, 2021. The attack has increases almost 3 times to up to 114 millions per day. That's the peak of the attack, but usually they will go up to about 80 million. So that's a lot of attacks you can see globally. Also because of the pandemic, because people are bored staying at home, and we can see a lot of credential abuse, so people trying to hack into other people's account to get information. So it's also increased to 1 billion type of attempts each day. So it's a definite thing with the current situation. We really need research on better methods to reduce this kind of cyber attacks or to detect these malicious attempts. But obviously, there's always challenges in research. So in cybersecurity area, to do this research, we need to, the challenges are rapid evolution of attacks. The attacks are ever changing. So there's always new kinds of attacks appear each day. There's also a thing to consider, the trade-off between time and accuracy, because some methods are very accurate, but it might take a long time, or some methods they are not so accurate, but you can do it very quickly. Another thing is the dataset representation, which I will go into today, on how well the quality of the dataset we have. And obviously, there's a lot of method these days using AI, so labels are also very important, but it's quite difficult to get the labels. So issues with existing data set, obviously the older data sets back in the days like DARPA and KDD, they do not represent real network traffic. Also, the data sets that created after that, there are limited number of attacks, and also these attacks can be outdated because they are all attacks back in the days, and they are all new attacks coming up each day. And some of the data sets are quite small, or the data sets that without labels at all, where they didn't describe any details of the attack type, like the Kyoto data set. So ideally, we would like data sets that will be able to represent modern architecture, such as they would have the current protocols that we have today, and also the network technology, such as network devices. And it would require to have different types of volume or representative of the current volume of attack and the variety of the attack instead of just a limited size of attack. So require a full set of records, because some of the data sets we can see they are always missing data or missing values that prevent from doing accurate tests or accurate evaluation of our the methods that we develop. Other kinds of problems or other types of ideal information that we need to create these data sets are we need to have the payload availability. This can be important if you want to look into payload, but some of the data like traffic data, they are all encrypted, so payload might not be required. The diversity of the attack, as mentioned, we need to have a lot of types of attack so that we can test the generality of our method. We need ground truth. The data sets or the generators that generate the data set can be reproduced so that we can help us to compare with other types of method and able to scale, because some of the attacks like the DDoS attack that mentioned previously, the DNS amplification attack, it scales quite big. Be able to interoperability and flexibility of the data set, and it needs to be high quality. So the condition or the quality of the data set obviously will kind of impact the accuracy of your results. So the current efforts we have in the world are globally to build a better data sets, like from Canadian Institute of Cybersecurity. They start to collaborate with telecommunication company and government agency to create a more realistic data sets and getting feedback from them on how attacks looks like in the data. They also use realistic attack and normal profile generators to create a more realistic behavior of attackers and human users or users' behavior. There's also an effort from the University of Seoul in South Korea, where they try to create data sets that are able to remove noise, where some of the meaningless data generated by the data collector, such as parser, can be removed, not to impact the data set. And they also use correlation analysis to avoid duplicates of records that sometimes is a mistake by those data set collectors. In Japan, there's also an effort on generating attack sequence based on MITRE ATT&CK framework, which use in line with the more up-to-date and current attacks that we have now. But they mentioned that their limitation is unable to validate how realistic the data set compared to real cyber attack, because these are still kind of generated in a closed environment. So they would need to talk with their NEC partners in order to check whether their attacks are actually realistic or not. So we need to build better data sets. So we are not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we are trying to use the current available technologies that we have. Sorry. So we are trying to create automatic dataset generation using this technology called the detection lab, where it's actually creating a virtual network environment automatically using scripts. These scripts are such as vagrant script, packer scripts that can configure all the information or type of setups you want for each host, and then you can just deploy it and it will generate it automatically for you. And this tool or this technology, you are able to customize it. You can increase the software or hardware as required. So here is a diagram of how a detection in the detection lab environment, creating an Active Directory environment where you have a logger where you collect all the data. So you have all these components where you have the monitoring device and all the services, and you have three different hosts where you have Windows servers, Windows servers and Windows 10. So each of them you can actually modify the configuration to include whatever components you want and services you want to create an ideal your virtual network environment. Another technology is the ELK stack. So the ELK stack is currently the de facto standards. So a lot of people in industry are using this for their SIEM or Security Operations Center to collect data. So we can actually use this technology to collect and then process our data set. So ELK stack consists of 4 different components. Before that is only ELK, which is 3, but now they add bits, which included in the stack, but we are still call it as the ELK stack. So we have the ELK stacks consists of Logstash, Elasticsearch, Kibana, and also bits. So the third one is because we need to generate actual attacks. So we want to have an up-to-date real-world attack simulation. So this is we want to introduce Attack IQ, which is a company started recent years, where they can actually generate attacks or ransomware attacks that happened in the past, so such as Lockheed, NotPetya, Ryuk, and SamSam. So they are also in line with the MITRE attack frameworks, and they keep updating their database to add more attacks as it happened. So now let me talk about the work that we've done here. So we actually developed a framework to actually generate data sets. So we combined all the technologies that I've done before. And we've actually done a bit of proof of concept here. And it shows that we actually can collect all this data set easily by using all those scripts and the methods that I've talked before. Here are the benefits of scalable data set generations that we can have. So we are aiming to have scalability, reproducibility, and flexibility. So we are hoping to build use actual hardware, or to actually create scripts to deploy actual hardware based on the detection lab technology that we have, collect different types of data. So instead of network traffic, we need to include other data like logs or system data. We're also going to try and do smarter collection, reducing the size of data we need to collect, and integrate detection mechanism. So that's all from me.
Great, thanks very much, Dr. Clay. We've got time for perhaps one quick question from the audience. Just aware that everyone's going to be on a schedule today, so I'm having to be a bit strict on timing. I'm sorry about that. So we've got a question here from Yuval Shavit. The question is, how do you sufficiently diversify in the network RTT, network congestion, etc., and benign application activity?
So the thing is, using Attack IQ, they actually have attack procedures following what the attackers have used in the past. So I think the Attack IQ actually have that. So we just deploy it and it will create a path. And we can also change some of the settings immediately. So yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Abigail and Yuval, for the question, and we can put people in contact after the event for those more detailed discussions. So it's now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Ivano Bongiovanni, one of our colleagues here at UQ. He's a lecturer in information security governance, policy and leadership. His research interests include cybersecurity management, human-centered security, human factor analysis, organizational vulnerability assessment, and design thinking. Over to you. Thanks, Ivano.
Thanks, John. I believe you are okay with hearing me and seeing my screen. So I will start with a bit of an apology. I mean, we saw some very great presentations so far, quite technical, and my apologies on the fact that my presentation is actually non-technical. My work on cyber is really from a business and a human-centric type of perspective. And what I will present today is a project I'm currently working on and I'm developing, and I'm actually showing you the pilot that we have run of this project, and the intention is now to move forward in the second stages, in the following stages of the project. So as I said before, my work is really focused on kind of making cybersecurity understandable and translatable for end users, and by end users I mean mainly employees in organizations. So really look at how information security gets practiced in organizations from a compliance, leadership, behavioral perspective. Okay, so this project was actually born with an intent to kind of investigate how can we make, as I said, information security in general more user-centric, because we all know that we kind of talk about a lot of great solutions to protect our organizations, and then the human factor gets in the way, and then people still do silly things, behaviors that they shouldn't be having. So we can have all the best solutions in our organizations, but they might still not work. From that perspective, design thinking and design-led methods can really, I believe, help cybersecurity develop further and penetrate even more the organizational structures and make it more understood for employees, and can make really employees engage it with a better day. So we kind of developed this project to learn a little bit from how designers do this. Designers are actually considered to be some of the professionals that best understand what end users feel and do and want to do. And the idea is really to look at an innovative approach to look at cybersecurity. From a kind of a conceptual perspective, we kind of started from the assumption, and again, it's the assumption that we have been testing, that there is a little bit of a trade-off between the security of our organizational systems and how employees feel about those systems. And the assumption also develops along the lines of the more friction we create towards our end users, and again, I mean by end users, I mean employees, the less they feel about, they feel right about engaging with those systems. Okay, imagine, for instance, sometimes all those pop-up messages that we receive on our corporate laptops asking us to update our systems, and we kind of constantly skip them because we've got things to do, and you know what, we don't really have time to change our password now, so let's just move on and do something else, which are all behaviors that we kind of really see practice in organizations a lot. And we decided to focus on the financial services organizations because those are the organizations that A, are supposed to have the best security systems in practice, and B, kind of are facing four quite significant challenges. In financial services, technology development and adoption is usually faster than in other organizations, but besides probably the military and some government organizations. But from a commercial, consumer-focused perspective, technology development is very fast. Big governance structures are lagging and are a little bit misaligned, especially if we consider big corporations that work across different countries with different legislative systems. C, financial stability and national security are actually quite well intertwined. So even if technically speaking, they might not be considered critical infrastructures, some of those financial organizations actually are critical infrastructures. And D, last but not least, there is a bit of a diffusion, and we saw this in research and in the literature, of the so-called cybersecurity monoculture, which pretty much means that some of these big financial organizations, and by financial organizations, I mean insurance companies, banks, and so on and so forth, are actually using the same providers, especially, for instance, in terms of managed security services. And obviously, the replication of the same solutions can actually create, across different organizations, can actually create some vulnerabilities for companies that operate in the financial services industry. So the pilot project, as I said, a very small project that I conducted over in the UK. I worked with the two main banks, so one in retail, one a retail bank and one an investment bank, plus two fintech startups. And we kind of decided to bring in some fintech startups because the assumption was that the cybersecurity posture of large incumbents, such as banks, is quite different from the cybersecurity posture of financial tech startups that are actually really trying to push their products into the market and might not be considering, besides regulations, cybersecurity as something that is top of mind. So we kind of worked with a design agency, Snook, over in the UK, and we conducted some interviews with people in the banks and in the fintech organizations, and also some workshops. The interviews kind of highlighted findings that were not as surprising, if you want. So the idea is that we kind of asked them, what is the perception that employees in your organizations have towards information security? And we asked, did you see any difference between client-facing employees and back-office type of employees in terms of how they felt about implementing cybersecurity controls? The idea was probably, the hypothesis was maybe front office employees are more keen on satisfying clients' needs, more focused on productivity and getting stuff done. So they might be the ones that sometimes do take shortcuts in terms of information security, whereas back office employees might be a little bit more separated from clients and might stick to, for instance, policies and being compliant a little bit more. We actually did find that there was not a big difference. But what did we find is that these organizations told us, well, the very nature of cybersecurity sometimes makes end users disengage with it because they don't understand it, they don't know what's behind it. The chain of events for them is very, very hard to understand and grasp. Hence, they think of disengaging. Obviously, the concept of having more and more longer and longer supply chains in these organizations was something that interviews came up. And vulnerability across the supply chain mean vulnerability for the organization in itself. But again, the interviews didn't really highlight anything really starking, if we want. What was actually really interesting, though, was sharing with these people, with these participants in the workshops and in the interviews, some of the tools that we typically use in design to help end users engage. So we came up with this concept of security personas and security journey maps, and we actually built on the statement of someone in the interview that said, well, security also needs to be easy enough for people to use it. So the security personas that we came up with are just a tool that allows us to look at how employees conceive cybersecurity based on their psychological attitude, based on how their job tasks are designed, based on how much they know about IT and how much they don't know about IT, and also based on some of their psychological attitudes. So we kind of built different ones. This one, for instance, is for a back office employee. This again is for a client-facing employee, and this one, for instance, is for someone that sits a little bit between being client-facing and being in the back office type of position. And we kind of showed this to some of the cybersecurity managers working in these banks, and actually found it extremely valuable, because it really is a first step to customizing information security solutions a little bit more based on the type of employees they have. Now, another tool that we utilized was the concept of a security journey map. So mapping the security touch points that employees have from when they wake up in the morning, connect to their mobile phone at home and check their work emails, drive to work, swipe their access cards to access the organizational facilities, connect to internet, utilize platforms online and so forth, and really understand how they felt about the friction created by some of those security controls. And in this sense, the feedback that we got from the workshop in particular was that it was actually quite an innovative way to look at information security beyond the technical solutions. So we kind of, to wrap up, we kind of learned some interesting things. The main takeaway lesson is that cybersecurity is actually also a user experience that can be designed from my end user's perspective. Utilizing security journeys and security personas is actually quite a promising tool and promising action to do. We certainly need to establish a more common language and lexicon between the tech people and the kind of plain end users in the organizations. Some defensive measures probably should cater more for every employee's digital literacy. And last but not least, automation is certainly a solution, but as we know, not all processes can be automated, especially from a security perspective. In this sense, especially in those processes, user centricity is something we should keep top of mind. And that's about it. Thanks for your attention. I was wondering if there's any questions. I'm happy to take them. I believe John might have had some issues because I don't see him connected to the session anymore. So again, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, we can probably move on to the next presenter, I believe.
Thanks, Ivano. I think John may have unfortunately dropped out, so we might move on to the next presenter. So thank you very much. Which we do have Professor Yuval Shavitz with us from the School of Electrical Engineering at Tel Aviv University. And presentation will be on the detection of IP hijack attacks using deep learning. So if I could pass over would be fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me try and share my screen. I guess this is it. So it's a pleasure to be here. My understanding was that the purpose of this short workshop is to learn about what each other is doing. So I put less emphasis on depth and more about breadth of what I'm doing. In terms of relative research direction I'm doing in cybersecurity, the majority of my research is done on routing security, where I'm looking at how to apply deep learning techniques to detect IP hijack attacks, and I'm going to talk about it in a short while. And I'm also looking at the geopolitical aspects of this happening, particularly vis-a-vis China, which I think is very important for Australia. I also look at deep learning approaches for traffic classifications, it's an area I touched a few years ago, and now I'm returning to it with some new ideas. In general, when looking at deep learning, I found out that there's a suboptimal usage of current techniques, and I'm working on better technique, especially in the field of prediction, trying to predict events that can be learned from past data using LSTMs, etc. And recently we start looking at DNS Poisoning Attack, where I'm talking to Yuda Afek that presented his great work earlier. We're looking at other direction. So, you know, we look at the internet activity. It's client server based mostly. You know, this client send a query, get an answer from the server. During an attack, an hijack attack, an attacker diverts the traffic towards its own network, and as a result, is forming a man-in-the-middle attack. And neither client nor server are aware of what's happening, because while here I show a deflection to a faraway destination, it shouldn't be that far away, and delay may not be increased by significantly for the client and server to detect. Of course, the attacker can take the server out of the loop and do an impersonation attack. We see this too. And what is most common in this type of attack, the attacker would just stay in the loop, record everything, and enjoy espionage. And when I say record everything, we know internet traffic is encrypted. Encryption is, of course, not the end of the game. We can break encryption. And if I'm in the middle of the loop, I can play various downgrade attacks on the protocols in order to make it easier for me to break the encryption. So just one example of an IP hijack attack. This time is from France to the US, and you can see how traffic is traveling from France to the Ukraine instead of going westwards towards the US. This is a very interesting attack because it was not done with BGP, which is the usual tool that used in the past for this attack. And I'm really interested in exposing those type of attacks that are generally not known even by most of the research community. So how do we attack IP hijack attacks? So it is a hard problem, you know, both in the academia and the industry, we struggle with this. And while we see papers on this and we see products doing this, it's really hard. So what we did in our research here is that we had this observation that if you look at the route in the internet, it is basically a concatenation of networks along the route. So you go from one network to the next and the next, and each network has a specific role in the past. You know, the end networks are usually consumers or producers. You know, producers like Google and Facebook, consumers like end users, and in the middle there are various transit operator. They tend to be classified into hierarchies, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and also they a little bit different in terms of the geographical span. So if you look at the route, while it is dynamically changing over time, if it is a benign route, the roles of the ASs along this route would not change. And what's happening during a hijack attack is suddenly those role concatenation change. So our idea is to use deep learning in order to do those three things. First of all, we classify the ASs into groups by their roles, and we learn the roles automatically, of course. Then we use supervised learning to identify IP hijack attacks based on the rules and what we learn are good paths and bad paths. And even better, and these are new results we just have submitted for publication, we can even do unsupervised learning. So we can bypass the need to have a good labeled data set and detect hijack attacks with this unsupervised learning approach using those chaining violation rules, basically using the AS roles. So just the idea in broad terms. what we observed and our main understanding is that if you look at the ASs along the routes, it's not the ASs are the networks, okay? They are not that different from looking at the words in a sentence. And we know that in NLP there are various ways of analyzing the meaning of words, and the ones which we like the most is word2vec, and it is very well work. And they show that what they do, they take sentences, they embed them into some n-dimensional spaces, and then each word become a vector. And you can see that, for example, the vector king minus the vector man plus the vector woman is very similar to the vector of a queen, because the relationship between king and queen are the same as the relationship between a man and a woman, the words. So basically what it means is that similar words would cluster together, and the vector between words will between the word embedding will indicate the relationship. So we're trying to do the same thing with BGP. So we take a path, which is basically a string of ASs, we embed them based on the neighborhood in the string. This is exactly what people doing in NLP for sentences. They embed words based on their distances from other words in sentences. And when we do this, basically we have a vector for each AS, for each network, that represent its role in the language, in the routing language. So if you look at the graph, or it's a UMAP projection of a 32-dimensional embedding of all the networks in the world, you can see here that they tend to cluster well according to their geographical location. So here, for example, in red, you see lots of you see the networks in Oceania, and the Americas, Europe. Things really look like it seems that this thing really captures well a similarity between networks. This is a more detailed slide. I'm not going to go all over it. The idea was to take some specific exemplary networks and see who are the closest neighbor for this network. So you take, for example, level 3, which is a tier 1 provider, one of the top providers in the world, and you see who are their neighbors. And you see that the closest neighbor is another network owned by level 3. They're basically what we call siblings. And the next one is Telia, another tier 1, large tier 1 provider. And the next one is Verizon, another tier 1 provider. And the next one is KPN, another tier 1 provider. And then there's an outline. So in general, it seems that we're doing very well. Just one more example, we look at our own network, the IUCC, it's the Israeli University Computer Center. This is the network, the research network that connects the Israeli universities. And we ask, who are the closest in our embedding to this network? And you see the research network of Cyprus, you see a research network in Portugal, a university in Montenegro, a research network in Albania, and a research network in Jordan. So again, we see that the closest networks to this network are very similar in other aspects. Here, not in the role as a tier 1 provider, but the role as a research institution. And there are more examples here. If you look at the relationship, the same. So we took two siblings networks. These are two networks that belong to the same organization. In this case, it's Verizon. These are the two ones. And we looked at the vector that connects them, and we asked, who are the closest vectors that connect other two networks? And what we found are other siblings, other networks that belong to the same organization. So here you see two Telefonica networks, two Uninet networks, and these two networks, they have different names, but they belong to the same organization. So it seems that this is working in general. Indeed, when we try to do supervised learning and learn with these vectors about routes, we get very high accuracy in route classification. Basically, we got almost 100% of the green routes, the good benign routes we identify as green. With the red routes, we miss some of them. Very small percentage. Actually, this percentage is smaller than it looks here, because when we looked at all these 2.2% failures, and there were only a few hundreds of them, we found out that in 70% of the cases, our data was wrong, and what the deep learning machine managed to do was actually correct. So this is closer to 1% failure. Another thing we did is we looked at hijack attack not based on the ASs on the network alone, but based on the geography. And this is the first study that ever tried to do this type of things. And the problem here is, how do we know the routers along the route geographical location? And there are multiple geolocation databases. They all have different values. And what we did is that we built a new layer based on attention mechanism that attempts not only to learn using the labels what is a good pass and bad pass, but also we learn the validity of or the confidence of each database. And this helped the network to actually better identify hijacked routes. So we have results on this, and we have already been published. Now I want to move to the political issue of this. So, many countries do hijack attacks, and this includes, of course, China using its 3 championed networks, China Telecom, China Mobile, and Unicom, mostly the first 2. And the thing about China Telecom, for example, is that it is spreading worldwide. It has POPs all over. This is a rather old map. Now they already have multiple POPs in Africa, not just 2, and they're building more in other parts of the world. And what we found out is that China Telecom is using its network in order to hijack traffic of the US and its allies. So we wrote a paper, and these are just 2 examples from Europe to various portions where you see the routes going through China. For example, this is from Scandinavia to Japan, where you see the routes going through China. And here is from Italy to Thailand, again going through China. So we wrote this paper where we not only highlighted the Chinese activity, but also suggesting the American government to disallow China Telecom to operate in the US. I'm very glad to see that this week they actually listened to our advice, and they told China Telecom that they have 60 days to stop their operation in North America. I'm really glad about it. I think it's a big move for the democratic world to gain its security, to improve its security. And as you can see, this paper was really made a tremendous impact, both in terms of citation in the academic paper, but also in terms of policy bodies writing it and citing it in their recommendation. I was invited both to the US Senate and to the Canadian Parliament to discuss this and to be a witness in one of the security committees. So we really managed to improve security of the world. This is the paper, if you want to read it. I think it's nice, and we now have a follow-up paper coming out soon. This is just some example of where it was, how it was appeared in the media in the world. So I'll stop here. These are the papers that are relevant. On the left side, these are on IP hijack attack. On the right side, you can see our traffic classification papers, and on the bottom right, these are the papers on China activity. On the top, this is the one I told you about, and this is a new one that just is coming up. I suppose it will be published next month. Basically looking at the decade-long conflict between the US and its allies in China.
Fantastic. Thanks, Yuval. Look, and my apologies to everybody. I had a total internet failure here myself. I don't think the Chinese were involved. I think it was much more boring than that. Look, we do have time for one quick question on Yuval's presentation, which is coming from Siamak Layagi. And he's interested in the data sets that you've used, Yuval, and were these data sets that you collected yourself through traffic monitoring or from other sources? Can you tell us a little bit about that briefly, please?
So most of the data sets I collected myself. I have a cybersecurity company that is doing some unique work in this area, and I'm fortunate to be able to use the company's proprietary data for this. However, we do publish some of those data sets for the public to be used, especially for the geographical analysis. So the SASA paper, we published a very large data set that enable other people to do their own research in this area.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. From what I know of CMAC's research here at UQ, I think you'll be getting an email from him after this event. All right. Look, thanks very much, Professor Shavit. So moving right along, we next have Professor Itzhak Benenson, who is the head of Geosimulation and Spatial Analysis Laboratory at Tel Aviv University. And his research interests range from geosimulation and spatial analysis of urban and regional phenomena through to spatial big data analysis. And today he's going to be talking to us about the privacy of mobile phone data and asking a fairly provocative question. Have we been wrong? Have we been all wrong so far? So over to you, Itzhak.
Thank you very much, John. Let me share my screen. Here it goes. Oops. Okay, it's a pleasure for me to do this workshop. And as Itzhak Ben Israel said in the very beginning of this meeting, our research at Tel Aviv University is interdisciplinary. And actually, I came from the field of transportation modeling. And my problem is with data for transportation modeling. For transportation modeling, you have to know how many people move from the point A to point B in the area you consider. And there is a wonderful data set which is now available all over the world for this estimation. Is the data set of the mobile phone companies. And after you protected this database and prevented any possible attack on it, you have to make use of this data and you have a problem. It's a problem of privacy. Location privacy is considered as a problem that you cannot overcome that easily. Let's have a look at the data and then we will have a look at the standard view of the location privacy and how to disclose this privacy. So the data is very, very regular. It's a regular database that every mobile phone service provider is keeping at their headquarters. It's a record which is created every time you connect and disconnect from the network. Usually during the call, you connect and disconnect several times. So the record contains the information that the company needs for billing to charge the customer, to charge you. So what do they need for charging? Actually, they need the time of your call. So this is the major goal of the company, to keep the time known. So the record contains some identifier of the customer. Usually it's not the real phone number, it's some coded number. Then you have the exact time of the start of the connection, of the end of the connection. And then you have a data which presents the location of the user of the device which is connected. Typically, this data consists of two fields. One is the cell tower that log where the antenna is installed. And every tower has 3 antennas. Each one serves 120 degrees. The orientation of these antennas is established based on the demand of optimal service of users. And these database may become available to the adversary. Quite a lot of these databases are stolen and travel all over the world. And there is a problem. The problem is very easy. If the adversary has an access to the database, he can recognize you very, very easily, just following you during several calls. The problem is that if you consider the service area of every tower with 3 antennas and construct Voronoi coverage of the area and assume that the tower serves the area which is inside the Voronoi polygon. This coverage of Voronoi polygons becomes a system of coordinates. And very few of us repeat the same sequence of coordinates during their mobility in space. So you just take those databases, and it was done in the beginning of 2010 several times. You take this database of the mobile phone companies that they open for you for some specific reason. You investigate how the sequences are repeated, and you see that 4 or 5 coordinates, it means Voronoi polygons with the identifiers, is sufficient to identify 99.99% of the users. So if you have the database, access to the database, and you follow someone, you can recognize who is that in the database very easily, and then you can restore the whole history of calls and disclose a lot of information, personal information about that person. So that was the standard view. And again, trying to re-estimate all those mobility issues in the city for transportation modeling, we came in touch. It's a very long process. You have to get a lot of permission with the mobile phone company to understand how the network really works. It turned out that it works quite different from that abstract model that I presented in the previous slide. So I already said that every tower has 3 antennas mounted with 120 degrees of service. So when you connect to the antenna, the network knows quite a lot about you, much more than is stored for billing. The antenna knows the distance to you. It's not a continuous distance. It's the distance, it's what's called time trip bands, which are at resolution of 200 meters close to the antenna, and then the resolution gradually increases up to almost 1 kilometer at the maximum service distance, which is about 30 kilometers. And indeed, this is 30 kilometers. Every general antenna, which is not the antenna in the building, which is an antenna in the street, which this is the majority of antennas, can serve calls up to a distance of 32 kilometers. So that was the first sign. So if it's 32 kilometers, the service areas of 2 near antennas, the typical distance between antennas, between towers, is about several hundred meters in the city, 500, 700, 800. And most important, I didn't say that previously, that map of the towers is open to the public all over the world. So that Voronoi coverage in the previous slide can be easily constructed by the adversary. So in reality, it's different. So antennas can serve you at very large distances. Do they really do that? Yes, indeed they do. So this is what's called Peerage Curve that every mobile phone company constructs usually once a month to understand the balance of loads between the antennas. So you see the frequency of calls for 3 selected antennas as dependent on the distance to them. You see that up to 6,000 meters, it means 6 kilometers in the city, it's a huge distance. Antennas do serve people at these large distances. And these curves are very, very different. So every antenna has this specific curve. So this is a posteriori information, but based on it, with the help of bias analysis, you can restore the areas of service of every antenna. And we have done that for the entire country of Israel. So we're in touch with one of 3 large suppliers, which splits the market in Israel almost equally. So this is the typical map of several of the areas of service of several antennas of several cell towers in Israel. So you see a huge variety of areas of service, not necessarily continuous. It's visually very far away of the Voronoi coverage. And if you pay attention to the scale, so every cell here is 250 to 250 meters, you see that the typical area of service is much, much larger than 700 to 700 meters, which is the distance between average distance between cell towers in the city. If it's such a huge data set that covers the entire country, you can estimate the overlap between those probabilistic clouds of service that you get by means of Bayesian analysis and the Voronoi polygons. The overlap is very limited. It's at the level of 1/3. So Voronoi polygon, which were used for defining the location privacy, covers on average 1/3 of the real area of antenna service. And there is a huge variety of overlap. So there are 3% of antennas that do not overlap a Voronoi polygon at all. And only 3% of the real areas of service are inside the Voronoi polygon. So the typical view of the relation between the old traditional view and the real view of the location of the users in mobile phone network is like that. So this is the Voronoi polygon, and this is the real area of service. And if you limit yourself to 99 or 95% of probability of location, the area overlaps, but not more. And it's definitely much, much larger. So it's great at the level of theoretical estimates and averages, but you need a test in the field. Whether when you travel, you are really served by some antenna which is far away from you, or it's nonetheless all this theory was wrong and it's just a mathematical exercise, and this is always the nearest antenna. So we could not get that data, that kind of data in Israel. So companies are extremely suspicious to all those investigations. It's all over the world. So people, lawyers are all around. They apply to the court every moment they do. So official legal use of this great source of data is extremely limited. Everything is done at the level of huge areas, which are not some physical areas with population of 100,000, 100,000 people, which is definitely insufficient for modern transportation problems. So getting to Uppsala, we had volunteers who opened their GPS receivers on their phones, and simultaneously we were in touch together with our colleagues in Uppsala with a mobile phone company, which provided the data we previously analyzed in Israel. So this is the map of trajectories of the volunteers during 2 years. And this is actually the major result of that test, which proved that the traditional view of location is definitely wrong. It doesn't fit to reality. You see on the top, this is Voronoi polygon of the tower, and these are the rings of the first, second, and further neighbors of this Voronoi polygon. And this is the frequency of connections made by volunteers from the polygon of the tower. They were connected to itself, first ring, second ring, third ring, and up to the 6th ring. As you see, they were in the Voronoi polygon of the towers. They were connected to only in 1/3 of the cases. 2/3 were done from outside of that polygon. So indeed, in reality, we are talking through the antenna, which is quite far away from us. And this is the distribution. On the right, you see the distribution of the distances. So this is actually all about 2 first steps of our study. We are in front of the 3rd step. There is a huge overlap of the areas of service. It does not match to the traditional view at all. So our traditional view of location privacy of the mobile phone data is definitely wrong. What we have to do now, we have to get the proper data, which include the location at the level of that Peerage Curve or whatever, and estimate the privacy again based on the probabilistic view of the locations that we get during the first two steps. And this is what we're going to do very, very soon with our Swedish colleagues with real data. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to answer the questions.
Thanks very much, Professor Benenson. We have time, I think, for just one quick question before our last presentation for the session. Look, I don't see any, but am I to understand that the implication of this is that we have overestimated the privacy risk from analysing this kind of data, and that it's actually a much lower risk, a more benign type of modelling and mapping to do?
Yes, indeed. And the goal of all this study is to make the study of mobile phone data legal. So companies do not open the data. We actually don't know much about transportation, about mobility in the city, which may fit to the nowadays understanding of transportation. We have a lot of modes, scooters, bikes, buses, metro. We don't know how they interact. We have to know that much better, and the companies have to open the data. And this is the reason to open. It's not that dangerous.
I understood. Thanks. I guess you know, Google and their subsidiary Waze are probably laughing at us doing this kind of research, right? They know this with far greater precision than any of us as academics.
They all use GPS data.
Yeah.
GPS data have real privacy. That's the reason we will never get an access to Google data.
Yeah. Fascinating. All right, look, thanks very much once again. So our final presenter for today is Dr. Gwandong Bai. He's a senior lecturer here at the University of Queensland, and his research interests include privacy, formal methods on security, and software security. So today, Gwandong is going to talk to us about intra-domain web page fingerprinting with machine learning. So I'll hand over to you, Gwandong.
Yeah, thank you, John. Hi, everyone. So let me turn on my camera first. Hello, everyone. So I'm gonna introduce you one recent work we published in WWW this year, and it's about using machine learning to identify privacy issues from the encrypted traffic. So this work was done with my two students when they visited me from National University of Singapore and also Sichuan University. I'm going to start with the introduction of the fingerprinting attacks. So we know that nowadays most of the websites already employ HTTPS, which provides confidentiality and integrity of the web contents exchanged between the user and the website. However, some metadata is still available to the network attacker, especially those ISP level or government level internet censorship. So the attacker still can get like endpoint IPs and also some temporal or size patterns of the traffic, although the traffic has already been encrypted. So with the fingerprinting attack, the attacker can identify the websites that the victim user have visited or is visiting with a very high accuracy. So the state of the art already can achieve accuracy higher than 85%. And when it comes into the context of Web 2.0, fingerprinting seems become more challenging to the attacker because we know that those social media website has like single website might have millions of billions distinct pages. So the current website fingerprinting can only identify the website the user is visiting. So basically the attacker knows the user is visiting Facebook, but actually it's a very normal action that not too much privacy is leaked to the attacker. So in this context, we are thinking probably we could push the boundary of the fingerprinting by proposed intra-domain fingerprinting. That means within the website, within a social media like Facebook, we're gonna provide fingerprinting techniques that can identify the web page. So whether the user is visiting Trump's Facebook page or Joe Biden's Facebook page. So this is actually very sensitive, very privacy sensitive, because although the social media content itself is not sensitive and most of the time is public, but the browsing behavior of the user may link the user's identity to some sensitive thing like politician's page or some regional page. So this actually leaks the political orientation or religion of the user. So the goal of the intra-domain web page fingerprinting, as I just mentioned, is to identify the web page being visited or has been visited by the user from the encrypted network traffic. So here we assume the attacker has two capabilities. So during the training stage, the attacker can visit arbitrary web page in a social media site. And during the visiting, the attacker can obtain the traffic and train a classifier. And during the attack stage, the attacker monitor on the communication channel between the user and the social media site. And the goal of the attacker is to identify the page, the exact page the attacker is, the user is visiting. And we consider two settings. The first one is called closed world. That means all the pages of attacker's interest have been captured with the traffic and been considered when training the classifier of the attacker. And also the user only visit one page inside this closed world. And this is, you can say it's not that practical, and it's used for only benchmarking, basically to show the accuracy of this intra-domain web fingerprinting. And a more practical setting is called open world setting. So basically, the attacker only monitors a small set of the pages of interest, but the user can visit pages outside this set. So we call this monitored site, monitored pages, and those outside the monitored page, we call them unmonitored pages. So the challenges here to do the intra-domain fingerprinting is, as I mentioned, for traditional intra-domain fingerprinting, because they're from different web servers. So the configuration of the server or the application servers, the software version of different, like Apache or Tomcat, different application server, they have different features. And also the routing path may give some difference on the time or size information about the traffic. However, in the intra-domain fingerprinting context, all the pages are from the same server. So if you visit Facebook, all the traffic are between the user and Facebook. And also those pages are mostly generated from the same template. They have very similar size or similar features. So I show you a very concrete example. We actually plot two pages. This is on the Instagram, 2 pages, and you can find, so the x-axis is the time and y-axis is the accumulated size, accumulated traffic size. So you can find at a particular time point, the size between these two web pages are quite similar. There is no sufficient entropy for the classifier to differentiate them. So, but we actually notice, those web social media websites tend to use CDN to host those large content for example, the images, the videos, or the audios. So it's possible, we can use this CDN traffic as features. So another factor I identify is where the user is browsing the web page. So when the web browser is not downloading all the contents at the same time. So instead, it downloads batch by batch. So it sends a batch of requests, HTTP requests to the server and fetch the content and do the rendering. And meanwhile, it will download next batch. So this formulates a thing called the burst. You can find if I plot the CDN traffic as a similar way, like what we did just now, we can find there is some gap, the gap between the batches. So this can actually be used as features to do the fingerprinting. So I will omit the details, but just give you the idea. Basically, we organize those adjacent packets into bursts, and then we use their size as the features to do the classification. And we evaluate this approach, this idea, with 4 data sets. We, 3 data sets we obtained from 4 social media websites. And I quickly show you the results. So we use the random forest to do the classification and use those, extensively used metrics during the evaluation. So I quickly show the result. You can find the CDN burst. This feature allow us to achieve a very high accuracy when doing intra-domain fingerprinting. And we also contact other evaluation, for example, the feasibility and scalability if we enlarge the unmonitored size. And also we investigate the factors such as the gap, the size of the gap, and also the network latency, those factors, how would they affect the effectiveness of our intra-domain fingerprinting. So you can find more details if you're interested from our paper. I will just quickly summary and give you takeaways. So basically this work reveals a new side channel. So the use of CDN for big content distribution, if amplified by browsers, page loading and rendering patterns, may leak web users' privacy. And second, our work demonstrates that intra-domain web page fingerprinting is feasible, and we call for more future research in this area. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gwandong. We've got a time for 1 or 2 quick questions before we wrap up. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, so I'm going to use the moderator's privilege to ask a question. What are some potential mitigations against this kind of attack? I'm thinking, fuzzing of response times in CDNs, that kind of thing. Have you contemplated any of that?
Yeah. Thanks, John. It's a very good question. We actually discussed this, and also we did some experiments in this project. So basically, we're adding some noise inside the server. The traffic server sent back to the client. So what does this noise do is to close the gap between the burst, so that it's not possible for the classifiers to group effective burst to do the differentiation.
Great, thanks very much. Question from Yuval. How do you treat the problem that users may not be directed to the same CDN locations in a geographical sense?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So basically, we assume the attacker is, so the attacker does not use, we assume the user does not use the anonymity networks like Tor. So that is possible for the attackers to identify the IP of the servers. So with this IP, the attacker actually understand, whether the server is a normal web server or a CDN server. But in our experiments, we did notice such thing. So basically, we just group all the traffic from the CDN servers. We didn't differentiate from different servers. But I think if we take into consideration of the different CDN servers, probably we can get more fine-grained features.
Great, thanks, Gwandong. So, look, we do have one last question, maybe just a quick response from you, Gwandong, from Mark Utting. He's asking, how does the new Apple preloading, the server-side preloading algorithm, preloading technique affect this algorithm? I hope I've translated your question properly, Mark.
Yeah, so Mark, I think it's quite related to the web browser cache, right? So during the data collection, we did clear the cache every time when we reload the page. But we argue that the size of the current web browser is quite small. The cache of the web browser is quite small. So that is not possible to, significantly affect the traffic between the client and the server. So each time almost the browser need to almost reload the entire pages, all the contents from the web server and CDN server.
Okay, thanks very much, Gwandong. So Mark's got a follow-up, but in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap it up. But it's really promising. There's clearly a lot of interest in this. So look, that's I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for their diverse, insightful, and really interesting presentation. And now it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Lior Tabansky to deliver some closing remarks. So Lior is the head of research and development at the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center at Tel Aviv. So Lior, over to you for the final comments for this for today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, first of all, to all the participants who represented a sample of each of the institution's activities. And also, thank you to the organizers. It turns out that it's quite a demanding labor to organize these important events, even when it is supposed to be easy due to the internet and remote. So we're happy that we reached out so far away. I hope I speak for both sides. Now, I certainly enjoyed this webinar. Every time I learn other activities, both here and in other places that represent the advances in different scientific disciplines. One thing that that became clear to me as we came through the presentation is that without planning, it turns out that all of our research that has been presented today combines scientific rigor, but also it's quite clear how it is timely and has policy relevance for different concerns and issues of this and the upcoming days. So I think that speaks volumes about the importance and relevance of each of the respective institutions' work. I believe that we will be hearing more and engage in further conversations. Hopefully moving ahead towards fruitful cooperation and research between the organizations. As you probably know, it's quite difficult for Tel Aviv University and for Israelis to reach to Australia because of obvious geographic distance. And I hope that we will be able to bridge this gap and bring forward mutually beneficial cooperations. So again, thank you for the organization and to all the presenters, and feel free to reach out either to the experts themselves or to myself to follow up and to try to develop further ideas and ideas for cooperation.
Thanks very much, Lior. So yeah, just on that note, we'll be doing a follow-up email to participants and presenters so that you'll be able to get each other's contact details. And as we always said, hopefully this can be the start of some fruitful conversations and ultimately research collaborations. Now, just before we go, two more things I want to mention. Firstly, I'd like to thank Victoria Bick and her team at UQ Global Engagement and Entrepreneurship for their work in putting together today's event. It's very much appreciated. It's been a pleasure working with you, Vic. And also just to plug two upcoming UQ events. Next Tuesday on the 9th of November, we're running a Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade sponsored event via the Australia Career Foundation, which is looking at promoting cybersecurity sector diversity and bilateral interdisciplinary research. There's that word again. It's been a great theme today. And we have a similar event with the Australia-Japan Foundation on the 15th of December. So you can find the details of those on UQ's global engagement pages. That's all we have time for. Thanks very much, participants, presenters, Professor Ben Israel, for your welcome, and those of you coming along. And I wish you all a great day, and thanks very much for coming.